Go serve. 3 words. Not screamed, not shouted, just delivered with that polished, practiced calm that lets cruelty pass as etiquette. Loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, quiet enough for everyone else to pretend they didn't. And when the finger pointed at her chest, something in the ballroom shifted, like the entire room had decided all at once that this was going to be the entertainment. Phones rose almost immediately, not in shock, in confidence. Someone angled for the best lighting under the chandeliers. Someone zoomed in on her face like they were filming a rare animal that had wandered into the wrong habitat. Someone's screen flashed live, and the whisper followed, sharp and excited. This is gonna go viral. Have you ever watched a room punish someone? Not because they did anything wrong, but because everyone decided they didn't belong? Before we go any further, if you believe dignity is not a joke, hit like and subscribe. And I'm genuinely curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I always want to know how far these stories travel. The wedding reception was expensive in all the ways that mattered to the people inside it. Gold light from crystal chandeliers, champagne that never seemed to run out, tuxedos tailored to bodies that had never carried heavy groceries, gowns that shimmered like status. Even the music felt curated, soft piano notes floating like perfume, meant to keep everything elegant no matter what happened. This was the kind of room where people smiled without warmth, because warmth wasn't required. Belonging was assumed. And standing near the center of it all, as if she had been placed there on purpose, was a black woman in a simple black dress. No glitter, no bold jewelry. No designer logo announcing her right to be seen. Hair pulled back cleanly, shoulders squared. Her phone rested near her collarbone, not raised to record, not held out to prove anything. Just there, like an anchor against a current she could already feel turning. She wasn't drinking. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't trying to blend in by performing small talk and expensive boredom. She was waiting, eyes steady, posture calm, as if she was listening for something the room couldn't hear yet. That calm, in a space built on unspoken rules, was the first offense. The second offense was that she didn't look apologetic for existing there. The woman who approached her wore navy like a uniform of authority. Elegant, fitted, perfectly timed smile. Her confidence wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in the way people made space for her without noticing they were doing it. She came with a small orbit of friends, men in tuxedos with practiced smirks, women with manicured hands already holding phones like tickets to a show. The navy-dressed woman looked the black woman up and down, not with curiosity, but with classification. Then she asked sweetly enough to sound polite, "What are you doing here?" The black woman answered simply, "I'm waiting." A pause. Then the navy woman laughed, turning slightly so others could join. "Waiting?" she echoed, as if that was the funniest word she'd heard all night. "Waiting for who?" People leaned, phones lifted higher. You could feel the room deciding where to place her story. A lone black woman in a luxury wedding ballroom, standing still, not being introduced, not being escorted, not being claimed by anyone in power. In their minds, there were only a few explanations, and none of them were flattering. The navy woman stepped closer, closing the space like it belonged to her. "Your staff, right?" she said lightly, as if she was offering help. "You shouldn't be standing with the guests." Laughter cracked across the room in small bursts, controlled, confident, the kind that says, "We all understand what she is." The black woman's face didn't change. "I'm not staff," she said. Calm. Even. That should have ended it. In a fair room it would have. But fairness wasn't what this room was designed for. The navy woman's smile shifted, sharper at the edges. "Oh," she said, tilting her head. "Then what are you? A guest?" She glanced toward the guest book table and the reserved seating, as if the room itself could confirm her suspicion. "Because I don't see your name. No one greeted you. No one recognizes you." Recognizes you. As if recognition was the only form of truth that mattered. A security guard at the edge of the ballroom turned his head. He hadn't been called yet, but he felt the change in the air. People like him were trained to respond to signals the wealthy didn't even realize they were sending. A few guests whispered to each other with the excitement of people who didn't have to be brave because nothing was happening to them. Someone murmured, "This is awkward." Someone else replied, No, it's funny. And then, as if to make sure the entire moment had a clear villain and a clear victim, the Navy woman leaned in and spoke louder, inviting the room to participate. "I've seen this before," she said. "People sneak into weddings, take pictures, pretend they were invited." She said pretend like it was a diagnosis. A couple of heads nodded. A few smiles widened. A phone zoomed tighter. The black woman's fingers tightened around her phone. She didn't raise it. She didn't show her screen. She didn't explain. Because she understood something the room didn't. Explanations were not accepted here. They were harvested, twisted, replayed. And then the Navy woman did what people like her do when they want cruelty to look reasonable. She created a test that could only end one way. A server passed by with a silver tray of champagne, and the Navy woman took it without asking, as casually as if she owned the staff, the room, and the night. The glasses clinked softly as she turned back and held the tray out toward the black woman's chest, forcing her to either reach or retreat. "Fine," the Navy woman said, smiling with manufactured sweetness. "If you're not staff, prove it." She tipped the tray slightly, just enough to make refusal look like hostility. "Go serve," she repeated, slow and clear. "Take this around. Offer drinks. Show everyone you're not here to cause a scene." And that's when the room laughed for real. Because now it was a game. Now it was a trap with rules the audience understood. If she took the tray, the phones would capture the humiliation they were hungry for. See, she is staff. If she refused, security would remove her, and the phones would capture a different satisfaction. See, she's disruptive. Either way, the crowd got their ending. The Navy woman leaned closer, voice lowering into something almost intimate, the way cruelty often does when it wants to feel justified. "Don't make this difficult," she said. "It's a wedding. Nobody wants drama. Just do your job and we'll forget about it." Forget. Like dignity was a stain that could be wiped away with a napkin. The security guard stepped forward now, not harshly, but with procedure. The quiet violence of policy. The circle tightened, bodies angling in to watch. The black woman looked at the tray, then lifted her gaze slowly across the faces around her. Phones held up like verdicts, smiles that didn't reach eyes, people who would tell themselves later they didn't really do anything. Her phone vibrated once against her collarbone. She didn't look down. She didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, trapped between two options designed to erase her either way. The Navy woman's smile held, but her eyes sharpened with impatience. "Well," she asked softly, "are you going to serve? Or should I have security escort you out?" The guard moved closer. The cameras waited. And under the crystal light of a room that had already decided who deserved respect, the trap fully closed. She did not reach for the tray. She did not step back either. The stillness that settled over her body was not hesitation, but memory. The kind that rises quietly when pressure tightens and reminds you who you had to become to survive. The room mistook that stillness for fear, just as so many rooms before it had. They always did. They never saw the years behind it. They never saw the kitchens with flickering lights, the late buses, the jobs stacked back to back. Not for ambition, but for necessity. They never saw the moment when life stopped being about potential and became about responsibility. Years earlier, she had stood in a narrow apartment kitchen while a doctor explained numbers that didn't feel real yet, somehow weighed more than anything she had carried before. Her mother sat across from her, hands folded, nodding politely, asking practical questions about treatments and schedules, as if the word expensive could be negotiated with calm. Later that night, when the doctor was gone and the silence settled in, her mother had finally allowed her shoulders to sag. "We'll be okay," she said, smiling the way parents do when they are trying to protect their children from truths they themselves are still learning to face. That smile had stayed with her longer than the diagnosis. It followed her through college classrooms, where she worked nights and studied days, through offices where she learned how to make herself useful without being visible, through meetings where her ideas were praised when repeated by someone else. She had learned early that brilliance without backing was treated like inconvenience, that talent without sponsorship was something people admired quietly and dismissed publicly. So she learned to wait. She learned to prepare. She learned that survival was not loud. It was methodical. The invitation she carried tonight was not a symbol of status. It was leverage earned through patience. A meeting arranged through channels that did not announce themselves. She had been told to arrive early and stay near the center of the room, not to draw attention, not to hide either. "We'll find you," the voice on the phone had said days ago, calm and certain, the kind of voice that didn't explain itself because it didn't need to. That voice belonged to someone who understood rooms like this from the inside. Her phone warmed against her collarbone again, buzzing faintly, insistently, and she resisted the urge to look. Timing mattered. Looking now would be read as weakness, as scrambling, as proof that she needed rescuing. She did not. Around her, the laughter had softened into anticipation, the kind that feeds on delay. The navy-dressed woman still held the tray out, enjoying the pause, enjoying the way the room leaned toward her certainty. People like her believed silence meant surrender. They had never learned what silence could also mean: control. At the edge of the ballroom, the security guard shifted his stance again, glancing between faces, uncertain now. He had been trained to respond to authority, but authority was beginning to blur. He noticed something the others didn't. The woman hadn't pleaded. She hadn't argued. She hadn't tried to explain herself into safety. That wasn't how people behaved when they were truly lost. Near one of the marble columns stood a man most of the guests had ignored until now. Older than most, dressed well but without flash, his posture relaxed in a way that came from long familiarity with rooms like this. He wasn't filming. He wasn't smiling. He was watching the interaction with a tightening focus, the way someone does when they recognize a pattern they've seen before and don't like where it leads. When his eyes met hers, there was no sympathy in them. No shock. Just recognition. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, a silent acknowledgement that said, "I see what's happening, and I see you." It steadied something inside her that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with grounding. Witnesses mattered, even quiet ones, especially quiet ones. Her thoughts moved faster now, not panicked, but precise. If she left with security, the meeting dissolved into rumor. People would say she hadn't belonged, that the invitation must have been a mistake, that she hadn't known how to handle herself. If she took the tray, the footage would outlive any explanation she tried to offer later. Images always did. This was not about embarrassment. This was about narrative ownership. She had spent too many years letting other people decide who she was in rooms they controlled. She would not let this room do the same. The navy-dressed woman leaned closer, her smile tightening as impatience crept in. "It's really not that serious," she said, soft enough to sound reasonable, loud enough to be heard. "You're making it awkward for everyone." Awkward. The word people used when their comfort was interrupted by someone else's humanity. Her phone vibrated again, more insistently this time. She allowed herself a glance, just long enough to read the message waiting beneath the missed calls. "I'm here." Her breath slowed. She did not look up immediately. She let the room feel the pause, let them sit with their own anticipation a moment longer. Then she raised her head and spoke, her voice low but steady, carrying farther than she intended, because the room had gone quiet without realizing it. "I understand you think this is simple," she said. "It isn't." A flicker crossed the navy-dressed woman's eyes. Not fear. Something closer to irritation edged with uncertainty. The certainty that had fueled her confidence wavered, just slightly, as if she had realized too late that the moment she thought she controlled might be larger than her. The security guard hesitated again, his training colliding with instinct. A few guests stopped smiling. A few phones lowered, not out of conscience, but curiosity. The silence thickened, no longer comfortable, no longer entertaining. And beneath the chandeliers, in a room that had mistaken patience for weakness and quiet for insignificance, the stakes became unmistakably clear. Whatever happened next would not be undone. The silence no longer felt accidental. It stretched with intention now, pressing against the edges of the room until even those enjoying the spectacle sensed that something had shifted. Phones adjusted angles. Whispers sharpened. What had begun as entertainment was turning into risk, and risk made people nervous. The navy-dressed woman felt it before she understood it, the way her smile held but stopped advancing, the way she straightened her shoulders, as if posture alone could restore control. She disliked pauses. Pauses invited questions, and questions were dangerous when a narrative depended on certainty. "Security," she said at last, her voice slightly louder, deliberately firm. "We don't have all night." The words were meant to reset the hierarchy, to remind everyone who was supposed to act and who was supposed to comply. The security guard stepped forward, then slowed, his movement betraying hesitation he couldn't fully explain. He had seen plenty of disruptions before, plenty of people protest loudly when they were in the wrong. This woman wasn't doing that. She wasn't arguing, wasn't pleading, wasn't scrambling to prove herself. That unsettled him. "Ma'am," he said carefully, lowering his voice as if proximity alone might calm the situation, "I'm going to need you to step aside so we can sort this out." Sort this out. The phrase sounded reasonable enough to the room, and that was the problem. Reasonable phrases were often the sharpest tools. Before she could respond, the chorus began to build, not coordinated but familiar. "Why is she making this so difficult?" someone said, not quite whispering. "If she belongs here, she'd just leave and clear it up," another added. "This isn't the place for this," a third voice chimed in, irritated now that the evening was no longer moving on schedule. Each comment stacked neatly on the last, creating a wall of social pressure that felt impersonal enough to excuse itself. The woman in black absorbed it without flinching. She had heard versions of this her entire life, always delivered with the same logic. Compliance was proof of innocence, resistance proof of guilt. She turned her head slightly and met the guard's eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she said calmly. "Not yet." The words were simple, but they did something unexpected. They slowed him. His feet stopped moving. Not because she outranked him, but because certainty had slipped out of the room, and no one had replaced it. The navy-dressed woman laughed sharply, the sound brittle now. "See?" she said, gesturing toward the woman in black as if presenting evidence. "Defiant. Disruptive. This is exactly why we have to be careful about who we let into events like this." She turned slightly toward the surrounding guests, performing her authority for them. "We're all here to celebrate, and she's turning it into a spectacle." The irony of the word hung in the air, unnoticed by those still filming. Live stream counts ticked upward. Somewhere online, strangers were already forming opinions without context, choosing sides without understanding what they were watching. The arena was no longer just the ballroom. It was the internet. The older man near the marble column narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening as he watched the escalation. He leaned toward the woman beside him and murmured something low and quick. She glanced toward the center of the room, concern replacing curiosity. A few guests stopped smiling altogether. A few phones lowered an inch, uncertainty creeping in. Doubt, once introduced, moved quietly, but decisively. The woman in black felt it too. This was the moment she had been preparing for, without knowing when it would arrive. The point where waiting became a decision rather than a delay. Her phone vibrated again, stronger now, and she allowed herself to look, just long enough to read the message that sat beneath the missed calls. "I'm 10 steps away." Her breath steadied. She did not smile. She did not look relieved. She simply lifted her gaze and addressed the room, not loudly, but clearly, the way someone speaks when they know they will be heard. "I came here with an invitation," she said. "I came here to have a conversation. I did not come here to be entertained at someone else's expense." A murmur rippled through the crowd, subtle but real. The navy-dressed woman scoffed, though the sound lacked its earlier confidence. "We've all heard you," she said. "And yet here we are." She turned back toward the guard. "Please." The guard inhaled, bracing himself to act, when a new movement disrupted the momentum. The older man stepped forward at last, unhurried but unmistakably decisive, placing himself between the guard and the woman in black without touching either of them. "I think we should slow down," he said calmly. His voice carried without effort. The room quieted just enough to hear him. "This is starting to look less like security, and more like something else." Heads turned. Phones adjusted. The navy-dressed woman stared at him, startled by the interruption. "And you are?" she asked sharply, irritation flashing through her composure. "A guest," he replied evenly. "Just like you." The pause that followed was heavier than the first, weighted with recognition. The guard stepped back half a pace, grateful for the hesitation being validated. The woman in black remained still, aware that the balance had shifted again, not because she had forced it, but because enough small resistances had finally aligned. The navy-dressed woman's eyes flicked between the man and the woman in black, recalculating. "This isn't your concern," she said, forcing a smile that no longer convinced. "We're handling it." The man nodded once. "It doesn't look like you are." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone whispered that this had gone too far. Another suggested everyone calm down. Online, the tone of the comments began to change, mockery giving way to questions. What's actually happening? Why is everyone filming her? This feels wrong. The woman in black felt the arena fully form around her now. There was no stepping back. Whatever came next would be seen, recorded, remembered. She drew a slow breath, grounding herself not in defiance, but in clarity. Her phone buzzed one final time, and this time she didn't look down. She didn't need to. From the edge of the ballroom, footsteps approached, deliberate and confident, cutting cleanly through the murmur. The navy-dressed woman turned toward the sound, irritation flashing, then faltering as recognition began to spread. The guard straightened. The older man shifted aside. A few guests went completely still. The woman in black did not turn around. She stayed exactly where she was, eyes forward, heart steady. As the room collectively sensed that the game they had been playing was about to end, whether they were ready for it or not. The footsteps did not rush. They never did. They crossed the marble floor with a measured confidence that announced presence without demanding attention, the kind that came from someone who had learned long ago that rooms eventually adjusted themselves if you gave them no choice. Conversations faltered mid-breath. Heads turned in sequence, recognition spreading faster than explanation. Phones that had been held high hesitated, their owners suddenly unsure whether recording was still wise. The man stepped into the light beneath the chandeliers, his suit immaculate but unflashy, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he belonged anywhere he chose to stand. The security guard straightened instinctively, hands moving behind his back. The older man who had intervened earlier inclined his head and stepped aside without being asked. The circle widened, not out of politeness, but reflex. Authority had entered the room, and it did not need to introduce itself. The man stopped beside the woman in black, close enough to signal alignment without touching her, close enough to make it unmistakably clear that she was not alone. He did not look at the tray. He did not look at the phones. He looked at her. "You made it," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. She nodded once. "I did." The simplicity of the exchange landed harder than any raised voice could have. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began stitching together details they hadn't known mattered. The navy-dressed woman laughed, sharp and forced, scrambling to regain momentum. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward. "This is a private event." The man turned to face her, expression polite but unreadable. "I'm aware," he replied. "I'm invited," she scoffed, though the sound rang hollow now. "Then perhaps you can explain why she's refusing to cooperate with security." She gestured toward the woman in black, clinging to the narrative she had built. "We're simply trying to maintain order." The man's eyes flicked briefly to the champagne tray, still hovering awkwardly between them, then returned to her face. "Order," he repeated. "Is that what you call this?" The question hung there, unadorned, exposing the moment for what it was. Phones lifted again, but this time with caution rather than confidence. The woman in black felt the center of gravity shift. This was the performance she had prepared for, not one of confrontation, but of truth delivered without spectacle. She reached into her clutch slowly, deliberately, each movement measured. A few guests inhaled, expecting drama that did not come. She withdrew a slim invitation card, its design understated, its edges crisp. She held it up calmly, not theatrically, just enough for those nearest to see. "This is my invitation," she said evenly. "It was verified before I arrived." The navy-dressed woman waved a hand dismissively, though her eyes flicked toward the card despite herself. "Anyone can print a card," she snapped. That doesn't prove anything. It proves I was expected, the woman in black replied. Whether you approve of me being here was never part of the agreement. The room shifted again. Someone whispered that this was getting uncomfortable. Someone else muttered that maybe they should all calm down. The man beside her reached into his jacket now and retrieved his phone, tapping the screen once before turning it outward. The name displayed there moved through the front rows like electricity. Eyes widened. A soft gasp escaped someone near the bar. Another person lowered their phone completely. The navy-dressed woman stared, confusion flickering into something closer to alarm. "What is that supposed to mean?" she demanded. "It means," the man said evenly, "that the conversation you've been avoiding is about to happen, whether you're ready or not." He turned briefly to the security guard. "You were doing your job," he added, not unkindly. "But I suggest you pause until the host confirms the guest list." The guard nodded immediately and stepped back, relief visible in his posture. Authority had clarified itself at last. The room went quiet, not with anticipation, but realization. The navy-dressed woman opened her mouth to speak again, then closed it, recalculating. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "You're both making a scene." The woman in black met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "You made it a scene," she said. "I came here to talk. You chose to perform." The words were not loud, but they carried. Then came the micro setback, sharp and sudden. A man pushed forward from the crowd, irritation written across his face. "Are we really going to let this derail the entire evening?" he said loudly. "People paid to be here. This isn't the place for personal drama." For a moment, the momentum wavered. A few heads nodded. Old instincts threatened to reassert themselves. The woman in black felt the familiar edge of dismissal brush against her again. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself. This was the moment where truth either fractured or held. She turned slightly, addressing not the man, but the room. "You're right," she said quietly. "This isn't the place for personal drama. That's why I didn't start it." She gestured gently toward the phone still hovering in the air. But once something is made public, it stops being personal. It becomes shared responsibility. The shift was immediate. Phones lowered. Someone near the back cleared their throat. The older man by the column nodded once, approval unmistakable. The man beside her spoke again, his voice calm, authoritative. "She's here because we asked her to be," he said. "She has something to offer this room that has nothing to do with serving drinks." He paused, letting the implication settle. If that makes anyone uncomfortable, that discomfort is worth examining. The navy-dressed woman's face drained of color. Her confidence collapsed inward, leaving only brittle defensiveness. "I didn't know," she said weakly. "That's the point," the woman in black replied. "You didn't need to know. You needed to stop." Silence followed, deeper than before. Not empty, but corrective. The champagne tray was gently taken back by the server, who retreated gratefully. The cameras that remained recording now captured something entirely different from what they had hoped for at the start of the night. The woman in black felt a quiet shift within herself. Not triumph, not vindication, but alignment. She no longer needed to brace against the room. The truth had spoken without raising its voice, and the room, finally, had no choice but to listen. The room did not erupt into applause. There were no cheers, no dramatic gasps, no sudden rush of vindication. Instead, something far more revealing happened. The room adjusted. Phones lowered, not out of courtesy, but instinct. Bodies shifted, creating space where none had existed before. The invisible lines that had once placed people into roles, host, guest, staff, intruder, began to blur, then quietly rearrange themselves. Attention moved away from the woman in navy, away from the champagne tray, away from the manufactured authority that had dominated the evening, and settled unmistakably on the woman in black, standing calmly at the center of it all. The security guard relaxed his shoulders, no longer braced for confrontation, and took a step back that felt less like retreat and more like correction. The host, who had hovered at the edge of the scene for several tense minutes, finally stepped forward, his expression carefully composed but strained. "I apologize," he said, voice professional, measured, the kind used to smooth over discomfort without fully addressing it. "There seems to have been some confusion." "There wasn't confusion," the woman in black replied gently. Her tone was not sharp. It didn't need to be. There was an assumption, and assumptions don't disappear just because they're uncomfortable. The host nodded quickly, the weight of the moment settling in. Of course, he said. Please, allow me. He gestured toward the reserved area near the front of the ballroom, the section that had been silently referenced earlier as proof of belonging. As she moved forward, the shift became undeniable. Guests who had laughed moments before now stepped aside, some offering tentative smiles, others avoiding eye contact entirely. A woman with silver hair and a composed presence approached her, hands clasped. I should have spoken up sooner, she said quietly. I'm sorry. The woman in black met her gaze and inclined her head. Thank you, she said. That matters. The exchange was small, but it landed with force. Others followed, not all with words, but with posture, with distance, with the sudden awareness of having been seen by the room itself. The older man who had stood by the column earlier approached next, his expression thoughtful. You handled that with restraint, he said. Most people wouldn't have. Restraint wasn't the goal, she replied. Clarity was. He nodded once, respect evident, and stepped back into the crowd. Across the room, the woman in navy stood alone now, her orbit gone, her confidence drained of oxygen. She watched as conversations resumed around her without her, felt the subtle but unmistakable shift from center to periphery. When she finally approached, her steps were slower, her posture altered. She stopped at a respectful distance, no longer invading space. I didn't realize, she said quietly. If I'd known. Knowing wouldn't have changed what you did, the woman in black replied, her voice steady. It would have changed how comfortable you felt doing it. The words were not cruel. They were accurate. The woman in navy absorbed them, her shoulders sagging slightly, then turned away without another word. No one followed. The host cleared his throat and attempted to restart the evening, the music returning softly, the schedule moving forward as if continuity alone could restore balance, but the balance had already shifted. Conversations restarted, but their tone was different now, more cautious, more aware. The room had been forced to watch itself behave, and that kind of witnessing left a mark. Seated now in the place she had been meant to occupy all along, the woman in black allowed herself a slow breath. The man who had arrived with such quiet authority leaned toward her slightly. You did exactly what was needed, he said. She shook her head gently. I did what couldn't be avoided. That's usually what changes things, he replied. Around them, opportunities surfaced not as announcements, but as proximity, a whispered request for an introduction, a discreet exchange of contact information, a conversation that began with substance instead of suspicion. She listened more than she spoke, careful not to confuse reversal with triumph. This wasn't a victory lap. This was a recalibration. Inside, something settled that had nothing to do with external validation. She had spent years adapting herself to rooms that demanded silence, in exchange for tolerance. Tonight, she learned that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, carried its own authority. As the evening continued, the cameras that remained captured a different image than the one they had chased earlier. A woman seated calmly among peers, no longer framed as spectacle, no longer defined by someone else's narrative. The witness who had nodded to her earlier passed by once more, offering a final glance of quiet approval before disappearing into the crowd. The security guard resumed his post with a clearer sense of alignment. The host circulated nervously, hyper-aware of optics, and the room, having turned once, did not turn back. When the man beside her rose to address the guests, he paused briefly, resting his hand near hers. Ready? He asked. She met his gaze, her voice steady when she answered. I've been ready longer than anyone here realized. And in that moment, it became clear that the power had not been transferred. It had been revealed, standing there all along, waiting for the room to catch up. The night did not end when the music faded, or when the guests finally filtered out into waiting cars and quiet conversations. It followed them home, settling into group chats and late-night reflections, replaying itself in fragments that felt heavier with each retelling. By morning, clips from the ballroom began to surface online, not with the celebratory captions people expected, but with questions. The footage did not need explanation. A woman standing still while a champagne tray hovered in accusation. Phones raised in confidence, then lowered in doubt. A room recalibrating in real time. Viewers watched and recognized something uncomfortably familiar. Why is no one stopping this? Why does this feel so normal? The comments multiplied, slower at first, then relentless, shifting from curiosity to indictment. The internet, for once, was not entertained. It was attentive. Messages flooded the woman in black's phone as the day unfolded, not just from people who had been there, but from strangers who had seen themselves in the silence of that room. Some apologized for not speaking up in their own lives. Some thanked her for standing without shouting. Some simply said they had never realized how quickly dignity could be turned into spectacle until they saw it happen, without filters or music. She read them carefully, not to absorb praise, but to understand impact. Attention was never the goal. Awareness was. Across town, the woman in navy woke to a different kind of mourning. Her name was being tagged, her image frozen mid-gesture, her words stripped of the context she had relied on to protect her. Invitations paused. Calls went unanswered. A board she had expected to join requested a conversation instead, the kind that began with concern and ended with distance. Friends who had laughed the loudest now softened their tone, offering neutrality disguised as loyalty. The cost arrived without theatrics, not as punishment, but as consequence, steady and cumulative. She realized too late that power was not the ability to humiliate without resistance, but the ability to withstand scrutiny when the room turned its gaze back on you. The security guard was called in that afternoon, not to be reprimanded, but to explain why he had hesitated. He spoke honestly, because something felt wrong, because authority didn't align. The supervisor listened, nodding slowly, replaying the footage on mute. Sometimes doing the job meant pausing long enough to recognize when procedure had become cover. The guard left with no medal, no announcement, just a quiet understanding that instinct, when informed by conscience, mattered. The older man who had intervened agreed to speak publicly days later, his tone measured, his words precise. He did not center himself. He described what he saw, a system operating smoothly until someone refused to comply. Universities requested permission to use the footage in ethics seminars. Companies circulated it internally with subject lines that avoided blame but invited reflection. The ballroom, once a stage for humiliation, became a case study. For the woman in black, the days that followed were deliberate. She accepted meetings that carried substance and declined those that smelled of opportunism. When asked about the incident, she did not recount the insult for effect. She framed it as information. This is what assumptions look like when left unchecked. This is how silence becomes policy. This is what changes when one person refuses to perform the role assigned to them. Her mother watched the footage once and turned it off. "You looked tired," she said softly. "I was," her daughter replied. "But you didn't bend," her mother added. The acknowledgement landed deeper than any headline. Weeks passed. Panels invited her to speak, not about resilience as spectacle, but about preparation, about understanding systems well enough to survive them, about knowing when patience protected you and when it erased you. She spoke calmly, refusing the language of revenge, emphasizing instead the discipline of clarity. The woman in navy resurfaced months later with a statement that acknowledged harm without theatrics. It did not undo what had happened. It did not need to. Accountability, when real, was rarely loud. Some accepted it, some didn't. That, too, was part of the cost. A handwritten note arrived from a woman who had apologized that night. It did not ask for forgiveness. It simply said, "Thank you for showing me what I didn't want to see." The woman in black kept it, not as proof of virtue, but as evidence of movement. On a clear morning months later, she stood at a podium in a room far less ornate than the ballroom, but charged with the same attention. She began not with her story, but with a question. How many of you have witnessed something wrong and called it order because it was easier? The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was intentional. She spoke plainly, letting the facts stand without adornment, trusting the audience to do the work of recognition themselves. When she finished, there was no standing ovation, no cinematic release. There was something better. Commitment. Later, as she gathered her notes, someone approached her quietly and said that night could have broken you. She paused, considering the truth beneath the words. It wasn't designed to break me, she replied. It was designed to reveal who others thought they were. Outside, the world moved on, as it always did, toward new distractions and louder controversies. The footage faded from feeds, replaced by fresh outrage and fleeting fascination. But something subtle remained. People looked twice now. Not out of fear, but awareness. The lesson did not shout. It endured. That night under the chandeliers had not elevated her. It had revealed her. Excellence had always been there, steady and unannounced. The room had simply been forced, at last, to see it